The lock clicked first. That was the sound Thomas Harland would never forget. A single sharp metallic snap behind him, final and clean, like a period placed at the end of a sentence that had been building for years. The front door of the farmhouse sealed shut while an icy Montana wind swept low across the porch and pushed the season's first thin snow through the yard in slow ghostly sheets. Thomas stood there on that porch with his 2 children and 2 grain sacks containing everything the 3 of them still owned in the world. Behind him, through the frosted glass, oil lamps still burned warm and steady inside. Supper plates still sat on the table exactly as the family had left them less than an hour before. The house looked completely unchanged from the outside. Except now it belonged to someone else entirely. Franklin Marsh, the older brother of Thomas's late wife Margaret, stood just inside the glass watching them without expression. No raised voice, no visible anger, no dramatic confrontation. Just that calm, settled face looking out at the 3 of them in the cold. Somehow that stillness felt sharper than any argument could have. 12-year-old Samuel stood beside his father on the porch, both shoulders pulled back deliberately against the wind. He already understood enough about the world to know what humiliation looked like, even when nobody said the word aloud. 9-year-old Clara pressed herself tightly against Thomas's coat sleeve, shaking hard enough that her boot heels made small soft tapping sounds against the porch boards beneath her feet. Franklin eventually opened the door and stepped outside. Warm yellow light spilled around his clean leather boots while the rest of the yard sank into early winter darkness. He held out a thin envelope toward Thomas along with the folded property transfer papers for the land. $280, Franklin said in a low, even voice. Enough to move your family southwest before the mountain passes freeze over completely. Thomas opened the envelope once, looked inside, then pressed it shut again without speaking. Franklin glanced briefly toward the children before continuing. Montana Territory is no place for a man raising 2 children without a wife. His tone stayed measured and quiet throughout. A father who was thinking clearly would have made this decision 6 months ago. Samuel's eyes dropped toward the porch boards at those words. Thomas never raised his voice in response. Never argued. Never lowered himself to beg. He simply took the envelope, turned away from the farmhouse, and guided his 2 children down the porch steps and into the black Montana night, where the first dusting of winter snow drifted low across the frozen ground like something searching for a place to rest. But Thomas did not take his children to the railway station the following morning. Instead, he walked Samuel and Clara directly into the county land registry office when it opened at first light. The building carried the smell of coal dust, damp wool coats, and old paper stacked too long in narrow rooms. Agnes Calloway, the county land records clerk, slid a thick property ledger across the desk containing all unclaimed and abandoned parcels that nobody else had filed for. Thomas worked through each page carefully until he reached the cheapest listing on the final column. Ironstone Hollow dugout cabin, 6 acres, $43. Agnes frowned the moment she recognized the parcel number. People around here call it the dead man's dip, she said, not unkindly. Last fellow who tried wintering there froze solid during the storm season of 1861. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he asked her exactly one question. Does it still have a roof? Agnes paused before answering. Most of one. By mid-afternoon, the trail leading down into Ironstone Hollow barely qualified as a trail at all. Thomas pulled the small wooden handcart through dead grass and patches of black exposed stone while Samuel pushed from behind with both palms flat against the back panel. Whenever the wheels dropped into old spring washouts cut deep into the ground, Samuel would dig his boot heels in and shove until the cart broke free again. The wind inside the hollow moved strangely compared to the open ground above. It did not hold any consistent direction. One moment the air went completely still and the silence pressed in from every side. The next, a hard sideways gust slammed through the ravine with enough force to nearly drag the cart toward the drop at the edge of the trail. Clara kept asking how much farther the cabin was. Thomas kept walking without answering her. The deeper they moved into Ironstone Hollow, the more Thomas began understanding something uncomfortable about that particular piece of country. The cold there did not feel like absence. It felt deliberate, like something that had been waiting patiently in that low ground for a long time and recognized the sound of people arriving. They spotted the cabin just before the last light disappeared behind the ridge. It barely cleared the slope of the hollow, sitting so low against the hillside that the earth appeared to have been gradually consuming it over many years of neglect. Sections of the sod roof had collapsed downward into the interior. One stone wall tilted outward at a visible angle, a long fracture running diagonally from the roofline toward the corner foundation. The front door hung crookedly on rusted iron hinges, open just enough to let wind slip through the gap and produce a low continuous sound like breath through a partially closed throat. No smoke. No tracks in the snow around the entrance. No sound except that hollow whistling through the boards. Samuel reached the doorway ahead of the others, chin lifted the way he always held it when he was trying to look older than he was. He stopped after one step inside and stood there without speaking. The cabin interior was dark and deeply cold. It carried the smell of wet ash and earth that had been sealed away from fresh air for too long. Behind him, Clara began crying quietly into the top of her scarf. Thomas walked the perimeter of the cabin while the remaining daylight faded across the hollow. That was when he discovered the worst detail. The entire north face of the structure had nearly vanished beneath accumulated packed dirt, dead root systems, and several seasons of drifted snow that had hardened into something closer to weak stone than frozen water. The cabin did not have the appearance of a place that had simply been left behind. It looked like something the ground had decided to reclaim entirely. Standing there in the rising cold of that first evening, Thomas understood with complete clarity that he may have led his children to a place where winter itself had chosen to take up permanent residence. The last of Thomas's money from Franklin's envelope disappeared quickly and without ceremony. Cornmeal, dried beans, a block of salt, a small tin of lard, 3 rolls of rough burlap, a handful of second-hand nails purchased from a blacksmith's scrap bucket at reduced price. That was the entire inventory of winter preparation. During daylight hours, Thomas climbed onto the sagging roof and pressed wet sod into the collapsed sections, weighting each patch down with flat stones hauled up from the hollow floor. Samuel worked along the base of the doorframe with armloads of dry bunchgrass, pushing it deep into the gaps where cold air moved through without resistance. Clara gathered broken deadwood branches from the ravine below and stacked them beside the hearth in careful rows by size. Water came from a half-frozen creek nearly half a mile below the cabin through the lower section of the hollow. By the time Thomas carried the filled buckets back up the slope, thin translucent ice had already begun forming around the edges of the water inside them. The cabin maintained a brutal cold through those first nights. Their breath left white clouds in the air above them continuously. Clara slept pressed flush against Thomas each night with both feet pushed beneath the fold of his heavy coat for warmth. Samuel lay beside them and worked hard to control his shivering, though Thomas could hear the boy's teeth clicking softly in the dark at regular intervals no matter how still he tried to hold himself. The old stone hearth produced limited results. Most of whatever heat the small fire generated moved almost immediately into the dirt walls and disappeared through the gaps in the damaged roof rather than staying inside the room where the family needed it. Except for one specific detail that Thomas began noticing on the third night. The long flat stone bench running along the wall beside the hearth stayed warm well after the fire had burned completely to ash. Not hot, not even close to hot. Simply faintly, stubbornly warm beneath a man's palm while everything else inside the cabin registered as dead cold. Thomas pressed his hand flat against it on the third night and confirmed it. He checked again on the fourth night and found the same result. Lying awake beside his sleeping children while winter wind dragged itself across the buried roof above them, Thomas began turning that single observation over and over in his mind. Either Franklin Marsh had been entirely correct from the beginning, or something inside that half-buried cabin still retained some knowledge about surviving Montana winters that the people currently occupying it had not yet learned. The wind shifted past midnight without warning and drove hard out of the north in sudden heavy bursts that shook loose dirt from the ceiling beams above the family's heads. A moment after the first major gust, smoke reversed direction through the flue and exploded back into the cabin interior. Samuel folded forward immediately, coughing into both hands. Clara pulled her blanket up over her face while thick dark smoke rolled in low layers across the cabin ceiling like weather trapped indoors. Thomas dropped to one knee beside the hearth and worked the burning wood apart with the iron poker, trying to keep a weak flame alive without flooding the room completely with smoke. That was the moment he heard it. A hollow knocking sound. Not from the hearth itself and not from the wind. From one of the flat stones set into the floor beside the long bench running along the wall. Thomas retrieved the old pry bar leaning against the corner and worked the flat metal edge beneath the stone slab. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the stone shifted with a deep grinding scrape that moved through the floorboards and up through the soles of his boots. Cold air rose from the gap beneath. Not freezing air. Dry air. Stable, consistent, dry air rising from somewhere below the floor of the cabin. Thomas pressed the pry bar deeper and worked the stone further aside until a black iron ring appeared, nearly flush with the surrounding floor and coated in old rust. For several seconds the only sounds in the cabin were Samuel coughing through the smoke and wind pressing down hard against the buried roof outside. Kneeling there beside that iron ring, Thomas understood something important had just shifted in the situation. Whoever had originally built this place had done so knowing exactly what Montana winters were capable of doing to the people living inside it. The iron hatch resisted him the entire way. Rust had sealed the edges tightly enough that Thomas had to brace one boot against the floor and pull with his full weight until the seal finally gave way with a low groan. A slow, careful breath of air moved upward from the darkness below the hatch. It carried no smell of rot, no damp earth odor, no mold or decay. The air that rose from below felt cool and remarkably steady, the way deep stone feels when it has been untouched by surface weather for a very long time. Thomas lit the oil lamp, lowered himself carefully through the opening, and climbed down while Samuel watched from above with wide eyes and both hands gripping the hatch frame. The underground chamber was round in shape and lined entirely with fitted flat stones that had darkened with age to the color of old charcoal. A curved stone bench ran along the far wall. Several wooden grain barrels had collapsed inward long ago, their staves split apart and dry as old bone. Beside the bench sat a leather-wrapped notebook coated in a heavy layer of dust. Black charcoal markings covered sections of the stone wall in irregular patterns. Several narrow tunnels opened at the base of the walls and disappeared into the earth beneath the cabin structure in different directions. The chamber did not feel like an abandoned space. It felt like a room that had been sealed carefully and left to wait. Thomas moved the oil lamp toward one of the tunnels and noticed something that settled the question he had been carrying since arriving at Ironstone Hollow. Even this far underground, the air remained dry enough to draw the surface moisture from the cracks in his hands within minutes of standing there. This was not a root cellar dug for storing vegetables through winter. Someone had engineered this space deliberately to survive beneath a Montana winter on purpose. The leather notebook belonged to a man named Silas Carver, an old trapper and stonemason who had lived in Ironstone Hollow during the decades before the territory was properly mapped. His handwriting was rough and compressed, clearly a man who wrote to record rather than to impress. No elaborate phrasing, no self-congratulation. Just short direct observations written by someone who had spent enough winters watching other people die from entirely preventable mistakes. Wet men die before cold ones do. Stone remembers heat long after flame forgets it. A low roof outlives a tall wall in wind country. Still air packed into dead space keeps a man alive better than any fire burning itself empty by midnight. Thomas read each line slowly with the oil lamp burning close beside the page while wind moved through the ground somewhere above the buried chamber roof. Silas had described the cabin structure the way a man describes a working tool rather than a shelter. The hearth was built directly against the long stone bench for a specific purpose. Heat generated by the fire was meant to sink into the rock mass and accumulate there slowly, then release that stored warmth gradually long after the flames died. The cellar below maintained dry air consistently, which was the actual enemy of cold. Narrow tunnels at floor level redirected cold drafts beneath the living surface rather than allowing wind to cut straight through the room at the height where people lived and slept. Even the wall construction carried purpose. The hollow spaces packed with wood ash did not simply fill gaps. They trapped pockets of completely still air, and still air insulated more effectively than solid timber of equivalent thickness. Then Thomas reached the passage written darker and pressed harder into the page than anything else in the notebook. Never allow the north drainage trench to close. A sealed trench causes the structure to breathe in reverse. Smoke will complete what the cold begins. Thomas stopped reading. His eyes lifted slowly from the page toward the north wall of the cabin above him. The wall that had nearly disappeared beneath packed earth, old root systems, and hardened drifted snow. The cabin had not simply deteriorated from neglect and time. It had been suffocating for years. The following morning, Thomas spread Silas Carver's notebook open across the stone bench and let Samuel read the warning about the north drainage trench twice through before either of them spoke. The boy read it a second time, then turned and looked directly toward the buried north wall of the cabin without saying anything. They started digging before the sun cleared the ridge above the hollow. The frozen ground resisted every shovel stroke like striking weak stone. The blade rang against the surface and sometimes bounced backward hard enough to send a jolt through Thomas's shoulders and up into the base of his neck. Wind drove through the ravine in violent diagonal gusts that filled the partially cleared trench almost as rapidly as the two of them could remove the dirt. By midday, Samuel's hands had cracked open beneath his work gloves in two places. The boy kept digging. Thomas kept pace beside him without slowing. Late in the afternoon, Thomas's shovel punched suddenly through empty space beneath a section of compacted earth that had seemed identical to everything surrounding it. He dropped to one knee and clawed frozen dirt aside by hand until the curved top of a narrow stone-lined tunnel appeared just below the surface. Cold air moved through it. Not wind. Draft. A controlled, directional flow of air moving exactly the way Silas Carver's notebook described it should. Thomas felt his pulse change for the first time since the three of them had arrived at Ironstone Hollow. That night they lit the hearth and Samuel knelt close beside the fire watching the smoke behavior as if it were something alive requiring careful observation. The smoke rose straighter than it had on any previous evening. Then the wind shifted again and smoke rolled back down the flue in a dark twisting column, though less severely than before. The cabin moved like an animal whose lungs had been partially cleared, breathing with effort still but breathing with more intent than before. Samuel stared at the fire for a long moment before speaking to the room rather than to his father specifically. "Do you think he actually survived here? The man who wrote the notebook?" Thomas kept reading long past the point when both children had fallen asleep. The majority of Silas Carver's notes were not centered on fire at all. They were about air movement and air quality in enclosed spaces through extended cold seasons.
Fire heats fast and wastes almost everything it generates. Still trapped air keeps men breathing through the night. The morning after, Thomas and Samuel pried several warped boards away from the interior wall surface of the dugout section. Behind them sat narrow hollow spaces packed with gray ash that had compacted and settled downward over years, dense and dry as powder. Thomas finally understood the complete logic of what Silas had built. Not thick walls designed to resist cold through sheer mass. Still walls with interior chambers of motionless insulating air designed to deny cold any pathway through them. By midday all three of them were working together on different sections of the structure. Thomas hauled buckets of red clay from the creek bank below the hollow while Samuel chopped dry bunchgrass into short fiber lengths with a blunted knife against a flat stone. Clara worked beside the hearth with quiet concentration, pressing cattail fiber carefully into small burlap squares and pushing them into the lower wall gaps near the floor where cold air most easily entered. Ash from the previous night's fire went back into the hollow interior wall spaces. Clay sealed the visible cracks along the exterior surface. Grass layers trapped additional pockets of completely still air between the clay applications. For the first time since arriving at Ironstone Hollow, the cabin began feeling less like a hollow in the earth and more like a structure with intention. Then Thomas made a mistake. One section of the east wall had been sealed with clay that was still carrying too much moisture when he pressed it into the gap. He recognized the problem the same evening when he pressed his thumb into the surface and felt it give slightly. But the temperature was falling fast outside and he told himself the seal would cure sufficiently overnight and moved on to other tasks. It did not cure. Samuel woke first in the deep hours of that night. Thin pale ice had formed along the inside surface of the east wall boards, not on the exterior where cold came from, but on the interior cabin side. Moisture drawn from the wet clay had frozen against the wood in delicate silver branching patterns that caught the lamplight when Thomas held it close. Thomas stood there studying it for a long time while Clara slept undisturbed beside the warm stone bench. The full weight of what that ice meant settled into him slowly and completely. Cold alone did not kill families in isolated winter cabins in Montana Territory. Dampness did. One careless repair applied in haste could convert a functioning shelter into a trap that worked against the people inside it before morning. 2 days following that, Thomas located a second tunnel beneath the cellar chamber. It opened behind the stone bench near the hearth at an angle that required a grown man to drop to hands and knees to enter. Before crawling inside, Thomas tied a rope securely around his waist and handed the other end to Samuel above with instructions to pull steadily and continuously if any section of the passage collapsed while he was inside it. The underground space pressed close against him from every direction. Thomas moved forward on his elbows with the oil lamp held low ahead of him, the flame burning small and careful in the reduced oxygen of the confined passage. Packed earth scraped against his coat across the full width of his shoulders. Cold stone touched both sides of his head simultaneously in the narrower sections. The further he pushed into the passage the more damage appeared in the lamplight. Multiple clay seals between the fitted stone sections had cracked apart completely, some recently and some long ago judging by the accumulation of fine dust inside the breaks. One section of the draft tunnel was clogged solid with dry grass and old mouse nesting material packed so densely that almost no air moved through it. Deeper still, a section of stone at one of the tunnel junctions had shifted inward and reduced the passage to roughly half its original interior diameter. The cabin had not failed all at once from a single catastrophic event. It had been slowly strangling across multiple seasons of minor damage accumulating without anyone present to address it. Thomas cleared what he could reach before working his way backward out of the passage nearly an hour later, his coat dark with dirt and his hands shaking from the sustained cold inside the tunnel. That evening, the fire behaved differently. Not dramatically, not in any way Clara would have necessarily noticed. But enough. The long stone bench beside the hearth held its warmth measurably longer after the flames settled low. Samuel discovered this first when he sat down without thinking and pulled his hand sharply away from the stone surface in surprise that he looked toward his father without speaking for several seconds. Then he said quietly to the still cabin interior, "It's actually working." Near midnight that same night, the wind drove hard across Ironstone Hollow and reversed the flue again. Smoke curled backward into the room, less than during the worst nights but still enough to darken the air above the hearth. The cabin was responding to the repairs, clearly and measurably, but it had not yet decided to trust the people working on it completely. Long after both children were asleep, Thomas sat with his back against the stone bench and rested one palm flat against the rock surface. The fire had been cold ash for more than an hour. The stone was still warm beneath his hand. Franklin Marsh rode down into Ironstone Hollow 3 days after that, having heard in town that Thomas had apparently lost his mind and started digging underneath a condemned dugout cabin in the middle of approaching winter. He found the family at work in the cold wind beside the structure when he arrived. Samuel was splitting flat stones with an old hammer that was noticeably heavy for his frame. Clara was pushing handfuls of dry grass into the lower wall gaps with focused and methodical patience. Thomas was pressing red clay between cracked boards with both bare hands stained completely dark from ash and earth mixed together. Franklin sat tall in the saddle and surveyed the scene for a long moment from horseback. His polished riding boots were still clean despite the mud below him. He looked at the sagging roofline, the half-buried north wall, the patched sections of stonework along the foundation. Then he laughed once, quietly and without real humor. "Lord above," he said. "You're burying those children alive in this place, Thomas." Thomas kept his hands moving against the clay and did not respond. That irritated Franklin visibly. A man who understands his own situation relocates his family south before the passes close for the season. His eyes moved across the structure again with obvious contempt. "This isn't a home. It's a hole in the ground with a roof that's already given up." Clara stopped moving when she heard that. Samuel lowered the hammer slowly until the head rested in the dirt beside his boot. Thomas continued pressing clay into the wall seam without pausing or turning around. Franklin eventually turned his horse and rode back up the trail toward the hollow rim without another word. The sound of hooves on frozen ground faded and then disappeared entirely. Samuel stood staring toward the empty trail for a long time after the sound was gone. Then he spoke without turning to face his father. "What if he's not wrong?" The temperature dropped hard that night. Wind tore through Ironstone Hollow in long sustained tones that rose and fell against the buried walls like something trying different approaches to find a way through. The fire burned low. Samuel and Clara eventually went to sleep beneath layered blankets near the hearth while Thomas sat alone in the cellar chamber below with the oil lamp and Silas Carver's notebook. One passage had been underlined twice in charcoal, harder than anything else on the page. "The storm destroys what stands against it. It moves past what stays low, dry, and patient." Beside that line, Silas had drawn a rough sketch of a badger sleeping inside a shallow earth hollow beneath a deep drift of snow, completely concealed, completely insulated, completely still while the weather above worked itself out. Thomas looked at that sketch for a long time without moving. Something shifted inside him while he sat there in the lamplit stone chamber beneath Ironstone Hollow. Something that had been positioned wrong since the night Franklin locked the farmhouse door behind them finally rotated into its correct place. Silas Carver had never approached a Montana winter as an opponent to be defeated. The men who treated prairie winters as adversaries to overcome through force of will or volume of firewood or sheer stubbornness generally ended up buried beneath the same ground they had refused to learn anything from. Silas had designed the cabin to survive beneath the storm instead of against it, low to the earth, sealed against moisture, patient enough to let the cold exhaust itself on the surface above while the people inside stayed dry and still and alive. Thomas climbed back into the cabin sometime after midnight. Clara had rolled in her sleep until her back rested against the long stone bench beside the hearth. One small open hand lay near the rock surface, close to the warmth still sitting inside it. Her breathing had changed since their first nights in the hollow. It no longer carried the shallow, tight quality of someone fighting cold in their sleep. It had become regular and slow. Thomas stood in the dark cabin and watched his daughter breathe for a while. Then he looked once toward the buried north wall. For the first time since Franklin had turned the lock behind them on that farmhouse porch, Thomas stopped calculating the cost of staying in Ironstone Hollow and started thinking only about what it would take to remain there through spring. They were not leaving. Over the days that followed, Thomas completed the repairs exactly as Silas Carver's notebook specified them. Fresh clay went into every cracked stone joint in the cellar chamber below. Dry ash refilled the hollow wall spaces that had settled and compacted over the years. The north drainage trench stayed open from the surface all the way down to the buried draft tunnel below the cabin floor. Thomas cleared the flue twice more by hand, pressing his fingers into the upper stone sections in temperatures that threatened to freeze his skin to the rock surface within seconds. Last came the cellar hatch. He melted tallow over the fire until it ran liquid and worked it carefully into the iron edge seams before pressing strips of rawhide into the gap around the frame to complete the seal. Then the family waited. That evening Thomas lit the hearth while Samuel knelt nearby in exactly the position he had occupied during every previous test, watching the smoke rise above the fire. This time it climbed in a clean, direct column without hesitation. No backdraft. No dark rolling layer collecting against the ceiling boards. Thomas moved a lit candle to the floor near the stone bench and held it still beside a narrow crack in the floorboards. The flame bent slowly and gently inward, drawn toward the hidden drainage trench running beneath the cabin floor. Not random air movement. Controlled draft, moving exactly as Silas had intended it to move when he built the system decades before. The change inside the cabin after that came gradually enough that Thomas kept second-guessing whether he was actually observing it or simply wanting to. The air never became warm in any absolute sense. But it stopped feeling hostile. The following morning, the water bucket beside the hearth had not developed ice on the surface overnight. Their blankets carried less frost in the fabric when they woke. Even their visible breath in the cold air seemed less dramatic than it had during the first weeks. That night Samuel sat down beside the long stone bench after the fire had burned to low coals. He pressed both palms flat against the rock and held them there. Then he looked across the cabin toward his father. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Samuel said quietly into the stillness, "It's breathing. The whole cabin is actually breathing." Jeremiah Holt came down into Ironstone Hollow on the coldest morning the season had produced to that point. The old rancher who ran the largest cattle operation in the lower valley had noticed something from his south pasture fence line at first light that he could not explain satisfactorily to himself and eventually decided to investigate directly. Smoke was rising from the Ironstone Hollow chimney, but only in a thin, low ribbon that stayed close to the roofline rather than the heavy dark column that typically poured from a cabin chimney once serious cold settled in. Every working cabin Jeremiah had known across 40 years of Montana ranching burned at least twice that volume of wood once the temperature dropped to this level. The thin smoke ribbon had caught his attention and would not release it. He expected to find suffering when Thomas opened the door. Instead, Jeremiah stepped into still air. Not warm air in the way a roaring stove produces warmth. Dry air. Calm, settled, stable air of the kind that did not begin attacking exposed skin the moment a man removed his gloves. Samuel sat near the hearth without shivering. Clara slept against the stone bench beneath a single folded blanket while a modest, controlled fire crackled quietly in the hearth. Jeremiah frowned at the size of the fire, then knelt beside the long stone bench and pressed one rough weathered hand flat against the surface. The warmth inside the rock had not come from recent flame. It had been accumulating in the stone mass for hours, stored there by a system the old rancher had never encountered before in any cabin he had entered during 4 decades in the territory that he stayed on one knee beside the bench for a long moment. Then he looked slowly toward the small controlled fire, then toward the buried walls surrounding them, then back toward the bench beneath his hand. Jeremiah Holt did not claim to understand the complete engineering of what Silas Carver had built in that hollow. But he understood enough to recognize something genuinely rare when he was sitting inside it. This cabin was managing heat in a way that no other structure he had ever entered was managing it. Before leaving, Jeremiah set 3 items quietly beside the door. A wrapped portion of cured elk meat. A cloth sack of dried carrots and onions. And a brass barometer in a cracked leather case with a worn adjustment wheel on the back. He looked once more toward the stone bench as he pulled his coat closed. "This cabin isn't warm," he said. "It just refuses to freeze." 2 mornings after Jeremiah Holt's visit, the brass barometer he had left beside the hearth began dropping. By noon it had fallen further than Thomas had ever seen a barometer needle travel on its scale. Jeremiah came through the valley road that same afternoon warning every homestead he passed that a white wall was building on the northern horizon above the high plains and moving south at the pace of a fast horse. Old ranchers began moving livestock closer to shelter that same afternoon without waiting for further evidence. Store owners in the small settlement 12 miles east of Ironstone Hollow nailed additional boards across their window frames. Then the signs that Silas Carver's notebook had described without explanation began appearing exactly as the old trapper had recorded them. Crows flew in low paths barely above the grass surface. Cattle turned their backs uniformly to the north wind hours before the air temperature changed enough for a person to measure the difference. The sky drained of color gradually across the entire visible horizon until the prairie resembled a landscape cast in dull lead rather than actual sky. Then the strangest sign of all arrived. The wind over Ironstone Hollow stopped completely for nearly 3 hours. An absolute, total, pressing silence that felt like the atmosphere itself drawing a breath before something large. Thomas did not spend that silence sitting inside. He hauled water uphill from the creek in repeated trips until his shoulder joints ached. Grain sacks went down through the cellar hatch. Dry ash and folded burlap went into the lower gaps around the door frame. The hearth fire stayed deliberately small and consistent rather than being pushed to maximum heat. Samuel watched the fire management with a puzzled expression until he could not hold the question any longer. Thomas pushed another piece of split wood carefully into the coals and answered without looking up. "Big fires waste everything they produce. The stone stores it. You want the stone working for you all night, not just while the wood is burning." Samuel nodded slowly and settled against the warm bench with his back straight. Outside, the prairie had gone pale white and perfectly still in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Thomas stood in the doorway near dusk and studied the draw below the cabin. The land had gone quiet in the specific way that country goes quiet when it is not resting but positioning itself. Standing there beneath that colorless sky, Thomas understood that the approaching night would determine whether Silas Carver had truly known what he was doing, or whether Ironstone Hollow would eventually receive one more name to add to its history of people who had not survived it. The blizzard did not build gradually. It did not announce itself with increasing wind or preliminary snow. One moment Ironstone Hollow sat beneath complete silence. The next, a solid white wall drove across the Montana plains and hit the hollow with the sound and force of a loaded freight wagon running off a collapsed bridge into darkness. Wind struck the buried cabin structure with a sustained violence that shook dirt loose from the ceiling beams and pressed the door inward against its frame hard enough to show light around the edges. Snow did not fall during that blizzard. It moved horizontally through the air in dense white sheets that erased the world beyond the small cabin windows within the first few minutes and did not relent. Inside the dugout, the buried earth walls absorbed the worst of the assault the way deep stone absorbs sound. The structure groaned under sustained pressure, but the packed soil around the lower half of the exterior kept the penetrating cold from cutting directly through the walls into the living space. The hearth burned low and controlled. Heat moved steadily into the long stone bench mass rather than being thrown upward into wasted ceiling air. Thomas moved through the cabin in a continuous circuit through the night. He inspected the flue opening for ice formation every hour without exception. He checked the rawhide seal around the cellar hatch at regular intervals. He crouched beside the narrow floor cracks near the stone bench and held a candle flame to the gap, watching it bend inward toward the hidden drainage trench beneath the floor. The draft still moved correctly. The cellar air remained dry. The stone bench continued releasing accumulated warmth steadily and patiently long after each fire cycle ended. Sometime deep in the worst hours of the storm, the wind shifted direction violently without warning. Smoke twisted backward down the flue in a sudden dark spiral, filling the ceiling space above the hearth. "Separate the fire," Thomas said immediately. Samuel moved to the hearth with the poker and pushed the burning sections apart while Thomas closed the lower draft opening beneath the firebox partially. For several tense seconds, smoke rolled in low layers across the upper half of the cabin interior. Then the system corrected. The draft reversed back to its intended direction. Smoke lifted up and out through the flue in a clean column. Thomas sat back against the stone bench and breathed steadily while the storm continued pressing down against the buried roof above them with everything it had. It was during those hours, listening to the blizzard work itself against the hollow, that Thomas finally understood the complete truth about Silas Carver and what the old trapper had actually built in that low ground all those decades ago. Silas had not designed this cabin for men with exceptional strength or exceptional resources or exceptional courage. He had built it for men with exceptional patience. Men who could listen carefully to what a Montana winter was actually doing rather than what they wished it would do. Men who could work with the cold rather than spend themselves fighting against it until they had nothing remaining, the strong men, the men who stacked wood to the ceiling and burned fires hot enough to blister paint and refused to let any cold through any gap no matter the cost. Those men ran out of wood before February and ran out of warmth shortly after. Silas had built a cabin that could be patient. And now Thomas Harland had learned to match it. The blizzard ran for 4 complete days before the wind lost its sustained force. When Thomas pushed the cabin door open on the 5th morning, snow pressed more than halfway up the frame from outside. Ironstone Hollow had been converted into a white basin of enormous drifts that reached wagon wheel height across most of the ravine floor. The cold that entered through the open door hit like inhaling broken glass. Then Thomas saw movement in the hollow below. Dark figures against the white. A line of people moving through the deep drifts in single file, each person stepping into the compressed track left by the one ahead of them to conserve energy. Jeremiah Holt led them forward with a rope tied around his own waist for the people directly behind him to grip if they went down. Several figures carried children wrapped inside coats. 2 men near the back of the line were supporting a third figure between them, one arm across each shoulder, half carrying the person through the drifts. The figure they were supporting was Franklin Marsh. His expensive winter riding coat was crusted white with ice from collar to hem. He could not move through the snow without assistance on both sides. By the time the group reached the cabin entrance, several adults were shaking with the specific uncontrolled trembling that comes from extended exposure rather than simple discomfort. Some could not form complete words. Jeremiah got one glove off with stiff fingers before speaking. The iron stove at the community hall gave out on the second night, he said, his voice reduced to a rough scrape. Water pipes throughout the building froze solid before morning of the third day. People started burning the meeting hall furniture to keep the room above freezing. He stopped to pull a full breath. A family down by the creek lost their youngest child on the third night. Exposure. Thomas looked past the group toward the direction of the settlement. No smoke rose above the tree line in that direction. Nothing rose above the tree line. Jeremiah turned and looked at the roof of the dugout cabin behind Thomas. "We could see heat coming up through your roof from the pasture," he said. "Not smoke from a heavy fire. Just warmth coming up through the snow itself from underneath. Like the ground was breathing." The old rancher looked at the half-buried cabin with something in his expression that had not been there during his earlier visit. Behind him, Franklin Marsh slowly raised his head. His face was raw from exposure and exhausted past the point where dignity requires continuous maintenance. He looked at the doorway of the same structure he had once described as a grave with a roof placed over it. And he stood there in the cold waiting without speaking. Thomas stepped back from the doorway and held it open wider. People moved inside one after another, carrying snow across the floorboards and dragging frozen boot soles through the entryway. Then a slow confusion spread through the group as they registered what the interior of the cabin actually felt like. There was no large roaring fire. No iron stove glowing red from maximum fuel. No blazing dramatic heat source of any kind. The fire in the hearth was modest by any standard. And yet once the door closed behind the last person and the wind was sealed outside, the cold that had been working at their exposed skin simply stopped. The air inside was dry. Stable. Livable in the specific way that prevents the body from continuing to lose ground against cold rather than the way that actively pushes cold away. Several people drifted toward the long stone bench beside the hearth without consciously deciding to move toward it. One woman placed her open hand against the rock surface and stared at it as if the warmth she felt there required explanation. Children stopped shivering first. Franklin lowered himself carefully against the wall beneath a blanket someone handed him. Jeremiah helped reseal the door against the wind outside. For a long moment after the door was secured, no one in the crowded cabin spoke. Then Franklin cleared his throat. He tried to find the voice he normally used, the one that implied organizational authority and settled questions before they opened. "We'll need to establish rationing," he said. "Someone needs to take charge of the supply situation before things become disorganized. You'll stay quiet in this house." Jeremiah Holt's voice carried through the cabin without effort and without apparent anger. The old rancher turned from the door and looked directly at Franklin. This man kept 2 children alive through a 4-day Dakota blizzard using dirt, stone, ash, and patience. Jeremiah pointed once toward Thomas near the hearth. "While the rest of us were burning furniture and losing people. You'll show respect while you're standing under his roof." Complete silence followed that. No one disputed it. No one added to it. It simply settled. Thomas said nothing. He did not look toward Franklin for any acknowledgement. Did not wait for an apology or position himself to receive one. He walked across the cabin to the folded blanket stack near the cellar hatch, picked up one blanket, and carried it across the room. He held it out toward Franklin without comment. Franklin looked down at the blanket for several seconds without moving. Then he took it quietly and lowered his eyes. When the thaw arrived, Ironstone Hollow stopped being a place people avoided mentioning. Homesteaders began coming to the dugout through early spring. First to see it for themselves after hearing what had happened during the blizzard. Then to ask Thomas to show them specifically what the repairs had involved and why each element mattered. He walked them through the hollow wall ash insulation method, the stone heat storage principle, the drainage trench design and its relationship to the flue behavior, the importance of dry versus simply cold air in enclosed winter shelters. Ranchers started excavating dry cellar chambers beneath their existing cabins after hearing Jeremiah Holt describe the difference between the air quality inside Ironstone Hollow and the air inside every other structure he had entered during the storm. Stonemasons from neighboring settlements walked the buried draft trench with lanterns, studying how Silas Carver had solved the problem of cold air infiltration by directing it beneath the living surface rather than allowing it to move through the space where people slept. Thomas never described himself as an engineer or an expert of any kind. He explained what the winter had demonstrated. Keep the structure dry. Move cold drafts beneath the floor rather than through the room. Store heat inside stone mass rather than generating and immediately losing it with large fires. Never allow dampness to settle in any surface where people sleep or spend extended time. Silas Carver's original notebook remained open on the stone bench beside the hearth most evenings while Thomas copied the old trapper's observations into simpler diagrams and clearer language for other families to take home and apply to their own structures. By summer the settlement had stopped using the name Dead Man's Dip for the location entirely. People started calling it the Ember Hollow. Thomas eventually purchased the old farmhouse back using money earned helping neighboring settlers rebuild and properly insulate their structures for winter. But he never moved his family back into it. Instead the farmhouse became a cold-season resource building where families from the surrounding area gathered each autumn before the first snow to learn wall sealing, cellar construction, draft management, and moisture control before winter required those skills rather than after. Near the entrance to that workshop, Thomas hung Silas Carver's leather-wrapped notebook from a simple iron hook beside the door. Unlocked. Open. Available to anyone willing to read it. By late spring the snow had pulled back from Ironstone Hollow completely. Green grass came up through the muddy ground around the Ember Hollow cabin while prairie wind moved softly and without violence through the draw the way it did in every season that was not winter. The same wind still came through the hollow. But it no longer sounded the way it had during those first nights when Thomas had lain awake listening to it move over the buried roof. It no longer carried that patient, waiting quality. Thomas sat outside the cellar entrance one quiet evening watching Samuel teach Clara how to test the floor draft using a candle flame. The boy held the light low beside the narrow floor crack near the stone bench exactly the way Thomas had shown him during those first desperate weeks of repair. The flame bent gently inward toward the hidden drainage trench beneath the cabin floor. Clara smiled when she saw the flame move. Thomas rested one hand against the long stone bench beside him. The morning fire had been ash for several hours. The rock still held warmth in its deep layers, steady and patient and entirely unhurried. He finally understood what Silas Carver had been recording in that rough handwriting across all those notebook pages. Not survival techniques. Not construction methods. Something older and simpler than either. The earth does not offer comfort to the people who live close to it. It offers shelter, but only to those who take the time to understand its rules before the cold arrives to test whether they actually learn them. Thomas Harland had not survived a Montana blizzard through strength or resources or the force of his own will against the weather. He had survived through patience. Through listening carefully. Through dirt and ash and stone and time and a dead trapper's notebook found beneath a floor that almost no one had been willing to look under. And in the quiet movement of a candle flame beside his children in the warm spring evening air, the old knowledge continued breathing steadily, long after the storm that had tested it had exhausted itself and moved on.